Welcome back once again. So I mentioned on the last video lecture, so we've talked about elements. We've talked about how the atoms of elements get bonded together in different ways to form molecules. Molecules are the basic building blocks of compounds. And then we're going to see human body, other living things as well, are composed of compounds that can be divided up into two categories, inorganic and organic. And we're not going to stress too much out over the differences between inorganic and organic, but we do need to be aware that you're going to hear that terminology quite a bit. This is an inorganic compound, this is an organic one, so we do want to be familiar with this terminology. Okay, inorganic compounds include things like water, salts that we just talked about, sodium chloride, many acids and bases. We'll have a separate video lecture on what acids and bases mean. They're often smaller types of compounds. Your organic compounds, these are compounds that are associated with living things. And originally it was thought that organic compounds only came from living things or previously living things, and today we have organic chemists who in a laboratory can synthesize, they can produce these types of compounds artificially. So of course now we know that not all organic compounds come from just living things, but that's what that term organic is referring to. It's not organic like, hey man, I'm going to the grocery store and buying some organic food that hasn't been grown with any pesticides or hormones. It's referring to compounds that are often associated with living things or previously living things. Organic compounds contain carbon. Carbon is the main atom present in organic molecules. They're usually large molecules. They're bonded together covalently. Now up here we said your inorganic compounds, many of those are salts. So if you remember that's many inorganic compounds are types of salts, not all of them. Organic compounds include things like carbohydrates, your carbs, fats, proteins, and then your nucleic acids. Nucleic acids include things like DNA and RNA, and we'll have separate video lectures on those types of molecules later. Organic compounds, these are your main building blocks of the cells in your body, and therefore your tissues, because cells compose your tissues, tissues compose your organs, organs compose your organ systems make the whole body. So these organic compounds, your carbohydrates, your fats, your proteins, and your nucleic acids really do make up the bulk of the human body and other living things as well. But inorganic compounds are there also, like water. You guys know a great deal of your body mass comes from water, and that is a type of inorganic compound. Water is just H2O. It's a very small molecule. Lots of acids and bases. Usually, this is not always true, but most inorganic compounds do not have carbon in them. There are some exceptions to that, though. All right, so I mentioned that water is a type of inorganic compound, and we need to talk about water because water actually makes up 60 to 80% of the volume in living cells. So it is the most important compound for all living things, at least the ones we know about. Maybe there are some living things on Saturn that we don't know about yet, or one of the moons of Saturn that are based on something else, but all the living things on this planet contain lots and lots of water. And why is that? What makes water so great for living things? And why are living things, why are your cells and your body fluids composed primarily, or the fluids inside your cells and throughout your body's tissues, why are they composed of water? Well, some of the things that make water so compatible with life, it absorbs and releases heat slowly. You know that. A watched pot never boils because water absorbs heat fairly slowly. It releases heat fairly slowly. It takes hot water a long time to cool down. Think about vegetable oil, which is not water. That's a type of lipid or a mixture of lipids. And think about you put that on the stove and it heats up several hundred degrees very quickly, and it also cools down much more quickly. So water, though, absorbs and releases this heat slowly, and that makes it good for living things, because if you're a living thing, you don't want to have sudden changes in temperature. You need to maintain your temperature homeostasis, and so water is good at helping out with that. Another feature of water is when it evaporates, the evaporation uses heat to make that happen, so it can help cool you off. When you sweat winds up on the surface of your skin and it evaporates. The water gets converted into the gas form of water. That uses up some heat. It dissipates some of your body heat and helps cool you off. Water is the universal solvent in living things. So maybe you guys remember from earlier in school, a solution equals solutes dissolved in a solvent. Remember that from school? So you can have like a solution. If you had a glucose solution in a laboratory beaker, then you would have glucose molecules. Those would be solutes, whatever it is that's being dissolved, surrounded by water molecules. The water is your solvent. So in living things, inside our cells, in your tissues, all throughout your body, all these various other molecules that are dissolved and floating around in our fluids are solutes that are dissolved in water, which is the solvent. Water is our body's major transport mechanism, so your blood, all of your body fluids are water-based. So, and all these various substances are dissolved in that watery-based fluid, and that's how they get transported around the body. Water actually participates in some of the body's chemical reactions. We'll see a little bit later in terms of how that works. Cushioning of vital organs. Your abdominopelvic cavity is filled with that serous fluid that you're learning about over on the anatomy side for Unit 1. That's a watery-based fluid, and that helps lubricate and protect, cushions those organs. You have a fluid that bathes your brain and spinal cord called cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, and that helps cushion those vital organs as well. Water also plays a role in your fluid electrolyte balance. You'll be learning more about that later in A&P, but fluid balance means water in needs to equal water out in the human body. That's part of our homeostasis. You got to release, get rid of an equal amount of water that you take in each day in order for your body to continue to function properly. So those are a few of the beneficial properties of water that make it so good for living things. All right, salts, we've talked about those earlier. There are many different kinds of salts. These are inorganic compounds that dissociate in water. That's what a salt is. So we already talked about sodium chloride before. Remember that. But when you put sodium chloride, like salt, table salt crystals, what happens when you put them in water? They don't stay as little crystals. They dissolve in the water. So what's happening when sodium chloride dissolves in water? It actually breaks apart into the sodium ions plus the chloride negatively charged ions. All right, and that's true for other types of salts as well. For example, if we have magnesium chloride, would be written like that, because you've got a magnesium ion that's bonded to two chloride ions. If you dissolve that in water, like if you were in a chemistry lab and you had some magnesium chloride powder and you dissolved it in water, it would break apart into magnesium ions that have a double positive charge plus two chloride ions that have a negative charge. All right, so these are ions. And that's how these inorganic, that's what happens to these in our body fluids. All right, so when you take in salt in your diet, you don't have little chunks of sodium chloride crystals floating around in your body fluids. The sodium chloride dissolves in your body fluid, and sodium floats around in your body fluids in that form. Chloride ions float around in your body fluids in that form. So they have a charge, they have an electrical charge when they're actually in our body fluids. Because of that, they're also called electrolytes. So you guys have heard of that before. You got to make sure you replace your electrolytes after exercise or after you've perspired a lot on a hot day. So these include things like sodium and chloride and potassium ions. Remember, K is the symbol for potassium. You got to learn those symbols that are outlined in your study guide. Magnesium is another one, has a double positive charge. Anything like that that has a positive or a negative charge, when it's floating around in your body fluids, those come from ionic compounds, and they're called electrolytes. And as we move through the semester, we're going to see many different examples of electrolytes that are absolutely crucial for our bodies to function properly. Things like calcium. Calcium is a type of electrolyte. Sodium and potassium, you're going to get tired of hearing about sodium and potassium when we get to the muscular and the nervous systems, because in order for, like, your nervous system, you guys know your nervous system functions through electrical signaling. You actually generate electricity in your body in order for that to work. And the way that works, it's based on sodium and potassium ions. And so you'll see a lot about that later. Iron is another one. Iron exists as an ion in your body fluids as well. So these inorganic type compounds that we think of as salts tend to exist in our body fluids in the form of ions. All right, so water and salts, those are two of the most important types of inorganic compounds. So try to keep the classification of these straight. And then we also have acids and bases. And I'm going to do a separate video lecture on acids and bases and pH, because that's another aspect of basic chemistry you really need to. There are just a few things there you got to learn in order to be able to move forward in this class and your future classes. So that'll be the topic for our next video lecture.